and welcome to the dungeon. I'm your host Rob, and here on this channel we explore all things Dungeons & Dragons related, and occasionally other RPGs as well. Today is going to be part 2 of our Battlefield Controller video, and we're going to be looking at the actual specific spells. I'm just going to go through a bunch of spells by level. I'm not going to have time to go through all of them because there's just way too many, but I will talk about some of the ones I think are standouts, some of the ones I think maybe are overrated or underrated, and then some that I think are probably just best avoided. In general, these are going to be wizard spells. Some of them might overlap with Bard or Sorcerer or, Warlock or whoever. I will mention a few of the standouts for other classes. Druids have some decent area denial spells, so they're actually okay in this role as well. And they don't really have a lot of as much hard direct, creature control type stuff or crowd control as wizards have. But they do have a lot of conjurations and summons, which in their own way can be a type of battlefield control. Instead of eliminating enemies from the fight, you're just boosting the forces on your side and tipping the balance that way, which is not really the same thing, but it kind of serves the same purpose. So I wanted to mention druids, and even clerics can get things like planar ally or whatever. So all of them have ways that they can kind of go about doing this, but when it comes to actual crowd control, then really the wizard is kind of king, as I mentioned in the first video. So to start with cantrips, there's not a lot of good ones, but Minor Illusion is definitely worth considering. Especially since it requires an action to try to see through illusions. At worst, you're going to trade your action to cast the illusion, and they're going to trade their action to try to see through it. And if you're fighting one fairly powerful monster, that can often be a very, very fair trade, because now you are using your action to neutralize his action, and the rest of your party is still able to beat on it or do whatever. So it's definitely worth considering. As far as cantrips go, it's one of my favorites in general. Other decent ones, Ray of Frost, the damage isn't great, and the range is less than Firebolt, for example, but it does reduce movement speed for that round. I don't know that it's necessarily great, but combined, if you had a Warlock in your party with Repelling Blast, that can make a pretty funny combination when the Warlock keeps pushing it back and you keep slowing it so it can't actually even get to the party. There are a few other decent ones too. Frostbite is kind of similar to Vicious Mockery. It does more damage, but targets worse saving throw. And personally, I think Vicious Mockery is better. I would rather do less damage, but target a weaker save on most monsters than more damage, but a common save. But still, it's worth at least considering. If you're the kind of person who just loads up with all damage cantrips all the time, then at least consider something different. I'm not saying that it's not useful to have more than one type of damage to do. If you're just putting all your hopes on Firebolt and then you realize that half the stuff seems to be immune or resistant to fire, having Toll the Dead or something else like that as a complement to it is definitely a very, very good strategy. But you probably don't need 4 damage cantrips, is what I'm saying. As far as first level spells, there's a couple of real standouts here. One of them at low levels especially is Sleep. Sleep is an absolute god spell at level 1 and 2, and even level 3 it's still okay, but it very rapidly starts to fall off because you're always affecting the same number of hit points, and it doesn't scale anywhere near as quickly as monster hit points do. So at level 1, you could easily put 3 or 4 kobolds to sleep, or 3 goblins, or a couple of orcs. It doesn't really keep up, but there's no saving throw, and that's what really makes the spell good. So sleep if you're in very low level, but I would, either if I was a sorcerer or someone, I would trade it out for a different spell once I leveled up a bit more. And if I was a wizard, I would just stop, preparing it in my spell book. Fog Cloud, I mentioned in the first video. Fog Cloud is a very underrated spell, I find. I actually find a lot of people who, they think Darkness is great. And Darkness isn't bad either, don't get me wrong. We'll talk about Darkness when we get to level 2 spells. The only advantage Darkness really has, though, is that it can be mobile, because you can cast on an item and then carry that item. But Fog Cloud has way better range, way longer duration, 6 or 7 times the duration. And it's a first level spell, and it can affect a much bigger area. You can provide obscurement, so archers can't really shoot at you. They're going to have disadvantage. You can prevent enemy spellcasters from targeting you and your party. And this is very potent as a first level spell. And it's one that I don't really see a lot of people using ever. You know, obviously it's never going to be your like big go-to move to try to, you know, beat the big bad guy kind of thing. But if he's got a bunch of archers or minions, you could, you know, throw it down between them or between you and them or on them or whatever, and just try to force them to come in and try to melee with your party, and just allow your hand-to-hand guys to start cleaning them up, because they're not able to just sit back and shoot at you. And if they do, they're going to have disadvantage and they're probably not going to hit anything anyways. So for first level spells, it is very powerful. I quite like Grease. The area of effect's pretty small. I think it's 10 foot, but there's no concentration, and it's pretty decent because it persists. And you know, not only does everybody in there have to make a saving throw, but they have to make a saving throw when they try to come through the area as well. And you know, and then you can just knock them prone, and prone's not a great condition to inflict on somebody, but at first level, for a first level spell, it's really, really good. If you're using a 6th level spell to knock guys prone, that's not so great. But for a first level spell, prone is fine. So I really like that one as well. Other good ones are Tasha's Hideous Laughter. It is only single target, which I'm not as huge of a fan of, but it's a first level spell. It's decent crowd control. They do get to repeat their saving throw every round, and I think they get advantage if they take damage. But you can just use it to try to disable one guy and then kill all his friends. And for that, it's pretty decent for a first level spell. If it was a 3rd or 4th level spell, I wouldn't like it at all. But as a first level spell, it's pretty solid. Level 2, I guess you also have things like Thunder Wave, which, I mean, they're not terrible. It's mostly a damage spell with a bit of a CC. And generally, those are going to be way weaker for the crowd control because they're also doing a lot of damage, or, you know, some damage. But, you know, damage with a crowd control added on is probably better than damage without crowd control added on. So it's not terrible. I'd give it like a 2 out of 5 or maybe a 3 out of 5, somewhere in that range. Not my go-to, but, you know, if you're a class that doesn't have a lot of these other ones and you have Thunder Wave, it might be better than nothing. Level 2 spells, Cloud of Daggers, I'm not a huge fan of, but it can serve a pretty useful function, like I mentioned in the first video, casting it in a narrow corridor or something. Or if you have somebody who's, you know, like maybe you cast Everd's Black Tentacles and manage to disable some of the enemies, and then one of your allies casts Cloud of Daggers on them while they're restrained, you can double up the damage, and they are already restrained and having a hard time escaping, and now it can start to be a pretty useful spell. Again, I wouldn't rate it very highly. I'd say it's probably another 2 out of 5 type spell, but it's not the worst thing ever. Flaming Sphere is pretty decent. It kind of fills the same function as Cloud of Daggers. It does less damage, but it is mobile, which is kind of nice. And it's decent enough that you can, you know, at least move it around and do some damage. Again, it's not one of my go-to picks. It's one of these space controller plus damage spells, which tend to be a lot weaker for the crowd control because it's also doing damage, like I said. But it's not the worst thing you could choose. Real standouts, though, are definitely things like Web. Web is an amazing spell, especially if you're like a sorcerer and you have Careful Spell or something like that. Or if you just have a really high initiative, like maybe you went Variant Human and took the Alert feat right off the bat, and you've got like 14 or 16 decks, you've got a decent high initiative, and now you can try to hit the enemies with Web before they've had a chance to engage with all your melee types, and you can just shut them down. And whoever doesn't get webbed, your melee guys just go beat on them and kill them, and it's just divide and conquer. And the thing I like about web is that, like I mentioned in the first video, it still remains useful at higher levels. It's a second level spell slot that still does the job, because you don't always need a wall of force. Maybe you're just fighting a bunch of stuff that's not very high level, but you're like, well, I don't really feel like taking a lot of damage anyways, so I'm just going to use web, and then I can just use cantrips every round, because that's all I'm going to need at that point. And that's where web becomes very handy. It does have the limitation, of course it requires concentration. It also requires anchor points, so it's not going to be great in every situation. If you're in like a huge giant cavern and the roof is like 50 or 100 feet up, web's not going to be the spell you need. But if you're fighting in like a room or something like that, or in a dungeon corridor, then web's going to be great. So bear that in mind. It also has some pretty nice conditions, because restrained is, obviously better than prone. So considering it's a second level spell, I think it's pretty strong. Other ones I kind of like, hold person. I mentioned as well earlier that I don't really like it when you're using it as a second level slot. And don't get me wrong, it's not terrible, I mean, it is kind of all or nothing. But if you're a level 3 cleric, for example, and hold person might be one of the only decent crowd control options you have, I would definitely pick it up. And it's probably worth trying. The nice thing is that it inflicts one of the worst conditions the monsters could be under in the game, which is paralysis. And now you've got advantage to attack them, and all hits are automatic crits. And your paladins and fighters and rangers and everybody is just going to absolutely go wild on the creature, and they're gonna love you for it. It's especially good though, like I said, when you can cast it on higher level creature or on higher level humans with higher level slots and hit 3 or 4 or 5 guys. It is humanoid only, which is a pretty big restriction in some cases, but it's not necessarily the worst. You usually fight humanoids on a somewhat consistent basis, so it's probably worth picking up. It might not be my first go-to if I'm a level 3 and I've got a couple choices only. I might choose something else instead, but I would definitely pick it up later regardless. I mentioned darkness. Like I said, I think in general I feel like it's worse than Fog Cloud, but there are some exceptions. If you're like a Shadow Sorcerer, or if you're a Warlock with Devil Sight, obviously it's going to be great. I always see people use it in melee with like blade locks and whatnot, but there's no reason you couldn't just be a caster Warlock who sits back, casts darkness on himself, surrounds himself in a sphere of darkness, and then just fires Eldritch Blast from out of it, because technically the enemy still can't see you. Rules as written, you'll have advantage to hit them because you have Devil Sight, of course, and they don't see you, so they have disadvantage to hit you. So under those kind of circumstances, it is a incredibly solid pick. It's like a 4 or 5 out of 5 in those cases. But in general, barring you having the ability to see through darkness yourself, with your enemies not being able to see through it, I generally prefer Fog Cloud, just because it's lower level and has better range and whatnot. Gust of Wind, not great, but it can be circumstantially okay. I feel the same way about Raven Feeblement. It's not a great spell, but there are worse. I'd rate both of those as like 2 out of 5 kind of thing. Blindness, Deafness. Unfortunately, it targets Constitution, which is one of the generally best saving throws that monsters get usually. So that's not great. But blindness is an amazing condition to inflict on them, and it doesn't require concentration. And this is where I really like the spell, because now you could be maintaining concentration on something else while blinding someone else, and you can start stacking up multiple different types of crowd control onto different enemies. So I do like it for that. And like I said, it is kind of circumstantial, but you also know, if you're fighting a dinosaur, you're probably not going to want to target its constitution. But if you're fighting, like a wizard or some dark elves or whatever, their constitution is probably not bad, but it's not going to be great necessarily. And then it is a much stronger choice. Plus, a lot of them will probably tend to be casters in those cases, and you can shut down their ability to target your party with spells. Worth mentioning as well is Heat Metal for bards and druids. I love Heat Metal when I'm fighting guys in armor, because they can't just drop the armor, right? If you cast it on a weapon, you're going to do some damage, and then they're going to have to drop the weapon or keep taking damage, and they're going to be disarmed, which is nice. But I like it even more on, if I'm fighting guys in plate mail or chain mail or whatever, because they don't have a choice. They're just taking that damage every round. So it's not necessarily a direct form of CC, although it can be if you disarm guys. But it's just worth pointing out, because there's not as many good choices for druids especially, but this is one of them. Maximilian's Earthen Grasp looks pretty decent on the surface. I can't really say that I like it though. I'm not a big fan. Silence. Also worth mentioning, especially because it's available for like rangers and bards and clerics, I believe. Yeah, clerics, rangers, bards. And so it's a nice CC against enemy casters because you can shut down their ability to use spells that require verbal components, which is the majority of spells. And so it's a very strong choice as well, especially if your dungeon master allows you to cast it on like objects or whatever. And then, if you have your barbarian and you cast it on his axe, and now he's just running around trying to beat on the enemy casters and maintaining, distance with them. And every time they try to move away now, he's getting opportunity attacks against them as well. Then in very short order, they're probably going to be dead because they're not going to have a chance to get a lot of spells off. Level 3, one of the best forms of crowd control is just counter spell. I'm sorry, it's one of the greatest spells in the game. Being able to neutralize the enemy spellcaster is phenomenally important. And my party recently fought like a lich actually, and the lich got completely owned because he couldn't even get any spells off. It didn't help that he rolled like a 4 for his initiative, so he was way down at the bottom of the line, and everybody else got to use all their actions, and the fighter, the arcane archer used action surge, so he's just pummeling this guy with all these arrows, doing a truckload of damage, plus sharpshooter. The barbarian is hacking away at him with his great axe and great weapon mastery. But even his legendary actions, he tries to use a spell, he gets counterspelled. He tried to counterspell that, he gets counterspelled by the bard counterspells him, then the wizard counterspells him, and then everything he tried to do, he just got shut down, and he got owned in one round. It didn't help that the paladin rolled a natural 20 on her final attack right before he would have gone, and then, proceeded to drop a level 4 smite on him and rolled, all 6s, 7s, and 8s essentially. I think she did like 80 damage to him in that one hit. And I even given this guy extra hit points because he was like a legendary lich type of guy, right? But it didn't matter. He got destroyed in one round and only got to use legendary actions. And it's just because they had 2 people in the party with counterspell and he wasn't able to get anything off. And in most of the good fights that my party has had, it's like the tough, challenging fights, it's because there's multiple spellcasters and they can't just shut down one guy. But when they're fighting like one really powerful caster, because they have 2 people who can cast counterspell, and the arcane archer also has a counterspell in his ring of spell storing that he can use in an emergency, spellcasters are really kind of a joke to these guys. They own them hard, and it's because of counterspell. So enough about counterspell. Other good CCs and bad CCs. It's worth mentioning you can get Wall of Sand and Wall of Water at this level, and both of those spells are absolutely terrible. They don't do what walls are supposed to do. I guess technically you could use Wall of Water and then somebody else could use like a cold spell and freeze it. That's in the rules. But now you're looking at a 2-person combo to make a terrible wall. They're both just really bad spells. And they don't restrict people from moving through, which is what a wall should do. And unlike Wall of Fire, which also doesn't, it doesn't even do damage to them or anything. So if you're hearing me talk about how great wall spells are, and you're like, oh, I'm going to grab Wall of Sand because it's only level 3 and it's the first wall spell available I can get, it is no good. At least not for that. It can provide obscurement, but once again, Fog Cloud could have done the same thing. And it's a 1st level spell, not a 3rd. Other ones, Hypnotic Pattern is one of the best crowd control spells in the game. And like I mentioned in the first video, it's just as good at level 20 as it is at level 5 when you first have it available. Fear is excellent as well. In some ways, I find it's better than Hypnotic Pattern, but it's much harder to use because it's a cone, and Hypnotic Pattern's, got good range on it. So I generally prefer Hypnotic Pattern, but Fear's a very strong choice too. If you're like maybe you're playing like a blade singer, or you're somebody who wants to be on the front line, like the Oath of Conquest Paladin gets Fear available as one of their class spells, and you're going to be a frontline fighter. So using a cone effect is perfectly fine in that case, because you're not going to be really worried about hitting your frontline party members, and you're going to be right up there and able to cast it. So fear becomes a very strong choice in those. I kind of consider things like fly almost in this category as well. I mean, technically it's more of a buff, of course, but if you're fighting something that, has flying and your party can't get at it, then you're kind of screwed. And being able to cast fly on your party members, maybe now your barbarian can get up there and can start attacking the thing, right? And that can have a similar effect of changing the dynamic of the fight. So it's definitely worth at least mentioning. It's not really a direct CC, but it is a pretty good spell for this type of situation. Slow, of course, is quite excellent because you can hit multiple creatures, and it doesn't remove them from the combat the way that something like Hypnotic Pattern would, but it's quite debilitating. And, now they can't even use like bonus actions and reactions. It's like very restrictive on what they can try to do. And because it hits so many things at once, I consider Slow to be a very good spell. I'd say it's like a 4 out of 5 for crowd control type effects. Maybe 3.5 because Hypnotic Pattern and Fear are still better in my opinion, but it's up there. Hunger of Hadar for Warlocks kind of serves the same purpose as Darkness, but it does do damage as well. So I don't know that it's necessarily that much better because it is a 3rd level spell instead of a 2nd, but the Darkness is pretty decent. And for Warlocks specifically, you do have access to things like Repelling Blast. So you can cast Hunger of Hadar on something, and when it takes a bunch of damage, and now it's difficult terrain as well, it tries to come out of the darkness, and you can push it back in and continue doing the damage. So I kind of like it for Warlocks. If it was available to everyone, I probably wouldn't consider it as good because I think Wizards have probably some stronger alternatives, like Hypnotic Pattern. But for Warlocks, it is a very good spell, especially combined with things like Repelling Blast. I find that Repelling Blast ends up being one of Warlock's best forms of crowd control, actually, because you're probably going to be using Eldritch Blast a lot anyways. And, we've had fights in some of our other campaigns where the wizard cast like Wall of Fire and these hill giants came through, and then the Warlock starts blasting them all with Repelling Blast and pushing them back into the wall again so that they take the damage the next round. And it's a very simple combo to pull off, but very, very effective too. So I really like Hunger of Hadar for Warlocks, given that they're taking other spells to complement it. For Clerics, Spirit Guardians is clearly worth mentioning. It is one of the best cleric spells there is, especially for 3rd level. Not necessarily for the C effects, but the damage scales really well and is persistent, and difficult terrain combined with the damage makes Spirit Guardians a great spell. And if you're a wizard or something, you might have some stronger options, but for clerics, they don't really have a lot. So I really, really like Spirit Guardians, and it scales far better than most other spells because it's persistent. So while Fireball, for example, is going up by 1 dice 6 for every spell level above 3 that you cast it at, it's only doing that damage once, and if they make a saving throw, like the average damage on a 6-sided dice is 3.5. So if you cast with a 4th level spell slot, your damage has gone up by an average of 3.5. But if they make the saving throw, it's only half of that. You look like a 1.75 damage, and you've had to upcast it with an extra spell, Whereas Spirit Guardians, even if they do make the saving throw, it's damaging them again the next round, and the next, and the next, as long as that cleric can maintain concentration. So the damage on it, combined with the fact that it's causing difficult terrain, I really, really like. 4th level spells, I mentioned Banishment. Banishment is really, really good if you're a sorcerer, like I mentioned, and you can take a hiding spell, or like a diviner wizard, and you can use Portent to cause somebody to fail. It's also good if you upcast it, but the problem with it compared to, say, like Hold Person, is that Hold Person is only a 2nd level spell. So casting it with a 4th level slot, you're now able to hit 3 targets. Banishment is a 4th level spell slot. So in order to hit 3 targets with it, now you're looking at casting it as a 6th level spell, and that's starting to get pretty pricey as far as your spells go. That being said, if you're fighting extraplanar beings like Celestials and Fae and Fiends, and you manage to maintain concentration for the duration, the Fiend is permanently banished and can't come back, or the Celestial or Fey or whatever it was. Permanently banished, can't come back, which is very nice. You don't have to worry about them, trying to come back and attack you later. They're just gone. Other ones I think are pretty good. I mentioned Evard's Black Tentacles. The damage is okay. The restraint condition is pretty decent. And the fact that it's a fairly decent area of effect, all combined, on their own, none of those effects are really good enough in my mind to make it a good spell for a 4th level spell slot. But the fact that it is a decent AoE, and it is decent damage, and it's persistent, and it inflicts a decent condition on creatures, all combined make it a pretty good spell. As far as area control spells or area denial, I really like Black Tentacles. It's a pretty strong choice. Watery Sphere is a very interesting choice because you can just like swallow things in the sphere, and even if they manage to escape it, you get to decide what space it comes out on. So if you're using like a battle map or a grid, then that can be kind of useful because you can possibly like move things into other terrain or drop them off cliffs or ledges or whatever. And so there's some nice effects there. Overall, I don't know that it's quite as good as some of the others. Excuse me, sorry. But it's still a pretty decent controlled spell overall. I'd say it's like a 3 out of 5. Other ones, we've got Confusion. Confusion would be a great spell if Hypnotic Pattern wasn't level 3 and better. There's still a chance that they're going to act normally. Yeah, they might turn on their buddies as well. I mean, but it's kind of random. I don't know. In general, I just prefer Hypnotic Pattern. But if you're fighting very intelligent enemies, or if you're fighting, like I said before, like elves and certain creatures that get advantage against those types of spells, then, Confusion can be a pretty good choice. And I'm not saying Confusion's a bad spell. I'm just saying that it's unfortunate that it's higher level than Hypnotic Pattern or Fear, and it's generally worse than either of them, in my opinion. Ice Storm, I mean, sure, it has some terrain effects, but it's mostly there for the damage. It's a decent damage spell, but as a crowd control, it's very weak. Like, if you're looking at it as a form of crowd control, unlike Evard's Black Tentacles, which is, decent due to everything else it has going for it, Ice Storm's like a 1 out of 5 for a CC. But then combined with the damage, I still think it's a decent spell. I'd rate it like a 2 or a 3 out of 5, somewhere in that range. Probably a 2 realistically, because I'm not super big on just direct damage spells. But there's worse choices you can make, that's for sure. And if you're just looking to say, like, hey, I need to do some damage and maybe inflict some other conditions as well, then Ice Storm's, it's not a bad choice. Warlocks Resilient Sphere, I see this one used a lot by wizards on themselves, especially with contingency, which is awesome because there's almost nothing that can happen now. You just, if I get down to quarter health, I'm going to cast Warlocks Resilient Sphere on myself, and now I'm just inside an impervious force field type bubble. It's pretty good. If you're using it as a crowd control, it's still really good. It's only the one target, but it's pretty awesome. And if you use it to like remove one particular powerful combatant from the fight, especially like martial type combatants who aren't going to be able to cast spells or anything like that, I think it's quite strong. Even against spellcasters, though, it's pretty decent. I mentioned Wall of Fire a lot in the last video. Like I said, it's not really, as far as walls go, it's not great compared to like Wall of Force and Wall of Stone and other actual walls that keep things out. But sometimes you don't necessarily want to keep things out. You just want to be able to soften them up enough so that the rest of your party can mow through them. You're fighting stuff that has like 30 or 40 hit points, and by the time it comes through the wall, it's going to be basically dead, And in those kind of cases, Wall of Fire is excellent. Plus, you can use it to like surround a group of enemies and then just burn them all, and now they have to come through the wall and they're going to take even more damage, and they can't just shoot out or else they're taking damage every round, and they don't have line of sight on the party anyway because it obscures the vision. And so overall, it's one of the rare exceptions where you get mostly damage with a bit of CC, but I still generally like it because it's shapeable, you can cast it at range, it can serve multiple purposes, from a defensive ring to protect the party to an offensive ring to lock things in and just burn them a bunch before they can escape. And just because it's very versatile, and the damage isn't great, but it's not bad either. And remember, the creatures only get a saving throw in the first round when the spell's initially cast. So if you ring a bunch of guys in, they get their saving throw and take half. But then if they don't decide to come through the wall and they just decide to sit in there and try to cast spells out or whatever, they're taking full damage after that. Or even if they charge through after the wall's already been established, now they're taking full damage for that too. So the persistent nature of the damage plus the versatility of the spell, I quite like it. If you're looking for an actual wall, there's better choices like Wall of Force or Wall of Stone. But for what it does, I think it's a very strong spell. Of course, there's also Polymorph. Now, I personally prefer Polymorph as a buff. Your fighter's down to 3 hit points, and rather than just try to heal them, knowing that the fire giant's going to crack them again for a bunch of damage next round, you just polymorph them into like a giant ape. Or if you're using, the Toma Beast, you polymorph them into a Savager. That's the go-to move for my party. Savager all the way. But you polymorph them into this, and now they've got, a bunch of temporary hit points. They're still able to fight. They're still doing some decent damage. Your beast choices start to really taper off at higher levels. And Polymorph, by the time you're like level 15, Polymorph's nowhere near as good as it was when you were level 7 as a buff. But it's still a decent choice for debuffs because you can, often disable a very, very strong combatant. And again, this is where things like Portent Dice or Heightened Spellcasting can be very nice because it is a one, an all or nothing type spell. And as a crowd control, I generally don't like those. But like I said, sometimes that's just what you need. Maybe you're, sometimes you're just fighting one powerful thing and you just need to remove it. But again, the other problem Polymorph and other similar spells have is that if you're fighting things with legendary resistances, they will just use a legendary resist. And legendary resistances is really the bane of like the save or suck type spells because they can just, I missed my saving throw. I will choose not to miss my saving throw. And, now you're out in action and a high level spell slot. I should probably mention Storm Sphere as well because it's available for druids. It's pretty good. I'd say it's like a 3 or a 4 out of 5. I quite like it. It's also on the wizard and I believe the sorcerer spell list as well. And, it has some nice effects. It's pretty decent. Level 5, Hold Monster. A lot of what I talked about under Hold Person still applies, but it is a much wider variety of things that can be hit by Hold Monster. In general, a lot of what I talked about with Hold Person still applies, but without the restriction of being able to only hit humanoids. It is harder to upcast it because, like I said, under Banishment, it has that same problem where now you're looking at a level 5 spell slot, and to upcast that as a 6th or 7th or 8th spell slot, it's becoming very, very costly. But again, like any save or suck spell, things like Heightened Spellcasting or Portent Dice can make it quite easy. Or if you're just able to target things that you know are going to be particularly weak against that save, then it can be pretty decent just because the paralysis condition is so deadly. It's not really as much of a CC in these cases though. It's more like I'll paralyze it so that my party can just destroy this thing in one round. And there's nothing wrong with that. That is perfectly fine. So bear in mind though that it does have some limitations. I kind of like Modify Memory. It's not necessarily a direct CC, but combined with things like Mass Suggestion or even just regular suggestion, it can be pretty decent for social situations where you can, suggest that somebody joins your side and then maybe you modify their memories after so that they think they were always on your side. And so it's definitely worth mentioning. It's not a spell I see used a lot, but it can be extremely powerful under the right circumstances. And it's really not hard to find those circumstances. So I definitely wanted to mention it. The Big B's hand spells, I quite like those, mostly just due to the versatility. If you're remember back to like 1st and 2nd edition, then there was actually a whole bunch of different Big B's hand spells of varying levels, and some were really weak at low levels and very strong at high levels. And I really like that they just consolidated them all into one spell, and now you can just choose what you want. And the high level effects aren't quite as good as they used to be, but the low level effects are better than they used to be. And it ends up being a pretty decent choice as a 5th level spell. And due to the fact that you can almost always find one of the things in there that you want your hand to do, it becomes a very strong spell. I quite like it a lot. I'd say it's a 4 out of 5. Unfortunately, though, it's competing at this level with Wall of Force, which is one of the best crowd control effects or spells in the game. Hands down. I talked about Wall of Force a lot in the first video, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this one. But the fact that, you know, you can choose the area, there's no saving throw, etc. It's hard to destroy, you know. It's just an amazing spell. It's kind of like the closest thing you have to an I win button in the game. So, and it's only level 5, whereas all the really strong spells it's competing with are things like Force Cage and Maze, etc. And those are all higher level spells. So for what it is a 5th level spell slot. It's amazing. Wall of Stone, which would be a 5 out of 5 if it wasn't for a Wall of Force, but it's worth mentioning because Wall of Stone is available to Sorcerers and Wall of Force isn't. And I can't remember if Warlocks get Wall of Force, but I don't think they do. So in cases where you have Wall of Stone but not Wall of Force available, Wall of Stone is an excellent, amazing spell and can do much of the same stuff. So it's not that it's bad or anything like that. If you don't have available Wall of Force, Wall of Stone would be my next go-to pick. Level 6 spells, Mass Suggestion. Honestly, for level 6 spells, it's one of the best spells you can get. It's amazing for social situations. And depending on how your DM rules it, you know, trying to tell things to switch sides and join your forces, the DM might not be cool with that. I don't know, it depends on the Dungeon Master. But to me, that's not necessarily a terribly unreasonable suggestion, especially if your party's winning the fight already. But things like, you know, flee or surrender and we will spare you, I think those are perfectly reasonable suggestions, especially if you've already killed a bunch of their companions. And, you know, in that case, it becomes very good. And it's worth noting that unlike Suggestion, the 2nd level spell, Mass Suggestion does not require concentration and it lasts 24 hours. Amazing spell, solid 5 out of 5. It's one of the best spells you can even have at this level. Auto's Irresistible Dance. I have mixed feelings on this spell because they actually have to make an ability check. I can't remember for sure. I should have looked it up before I made this video. Whatever. The point is, though, the spell is a decent CC, and it works automatically the first round. So at the very worst, they're going to have to use their action to try to break out of the spell. But it's a high-level spell slot. And like when I mentioned all these things like Hypnotic Pattern, how enemies can, you know, shake each other awake or damage will break them out of the spell and stuff, and trading your action for a bunch of their actions plus your spell slot, I think is a good trade. But when you're trading a 6th level spell slot for one other creature spell slot, that becomes a lot more dicey because you're not able to affect like 6 or 8 or 15 guys like you could with a Hypnotic Pattern. But depending on the circumstances, it can still be alright. It's not my go-to, but it could be worse. Wall of Ice, I think is pretty awful. It's not a 1 like Wall of Sand was, because at least it does form a wall. But you had Wall of Force last level. Wall of Ice is worse in every possible way, except it does a little bit of damage. But the damage is pathetic, especially for a 6th level spell. It's just nowhere near as good. Wall of Stone and Wall of Force are both superior. Not sure what else to say on that. It's not a great choice. Eye Bite, because it has a bunch of different conditions that conflict. It can inflict. Sorry, is pretty good. I like that one quite a bit. It does suffer from some of the same problems that any single target spells do, though, like, you know, legendary resistances and whatnot to neutralize it. But due to the fact that it has a bunch of things it can do, I still like it. Plane Shift for 7th level spells. Mostly people use Plane Shift as a way of just going to other planes, and honestly that should be its main purpose. because using it as a form of crowd control isn't really anywhere near as strong. I mean, remember that at this level, you have Force Cage available. One of the best, greatest spells in the entire game, hands down. And if you're normally like, well, I could take Force Cage, or I could try to plane shift this guy to, somewhere else. Plane shift is I mean, it's decent as a backup, I guess, if you need it. Maybe you took plane shift because you're like, yeah, we might need to go to other planes. And then in a pinch, I could use it to, form a crowd control and try to remove somebody and banish them somewhere else. Like, under those circumstances, because of the versatility, I'm not going to say it's bad. It's still like a 3 out of 5 type spell. It's just not as good as other choices. Whirlwind for Druids is an excellent choice at this level. I'd say it's a 4 or maybe even a 5 out of 5. It is an amazing spell. Obviously, I've already mentioned Force Cage. I could go on for Force Cage all day. It's one of the best spells in the entire game. It obviously it's a 5 out of 5. It's a 6 out of 5, really, is what I should say. It is so good. And we've already talked about that a lot. Not really much more to be said there. Level 8 spells, Maze, probably not quite as good as Force Cage, but in some circumstances even better. It's again one of the greatest crowd control spells you can get. Another solid 5 out of 5. I mentioned in the first video you could use it on something like the Tarrasque. The only problem with Maze compared to Force Cage, why I think it's worse, is because it does require your concentration and Force Cage doesn't. But I mean, a DC 20 intelligence check is not easy for something to make. In some ways, it can be harder to escape the maze than it can be the Force Cage, because if you're dealing with things that can teleport or travel to different planes of existence, then they can try to get out of the cage. Whereas the maze, it's just the DC 20 intelligence check. Now, granted, there's like Garistro demons and Minotaurs make that intelligence roll automatically, but I'm going to assume that if you're, high enough to cast maze, you've probably read the spell and realized by now that I'm just not going to cast this on Minotaurs, So that's pretty much a moot point entirely. But yeah, Maze is an excellent choice. And it's worth remembering, like I mentioned in the first video, it's an intelligence check, not a saving throw. So legendary resists, no good. Magic resistance, doesn't matter. And because proficiency bonuses tend to scale with the monsters as well, while they're getting more hit dice and everything else, they generally have pretty good saving throws against certain things. Maybe not intelligence in a lot of cases, but they have pretty good saving throws. But ability checks don't tend to scale on monsters as well. Like, it's very rare you see monsters in the monster manual that have big, stat boosts to their ability checks. And their ability check requires an action. So even in the worst case scenario, if you cast Maze on some, ancient red dragon or whatever, and then he ends up making his ability score, he's still gone for the round because that required his action. And so at the very worst case scenario, it's still at least going to work for the one round in which you cast it in. Other strong choices, Antipathy Sympathy, is a very strong spell. It can be a little harder to set up than some of these others, but it has a variety of things it can do, which I like, and a lot of them are very, very strong choices. Excellent spell. I highly rate it. It's probably a 4 to 5. Feeble Mind, I have a hard time rating this one because against enemy casters, it's actually a pretty good spell overall, because only wizards are going to have a good intelligence saving throw. Whereas when you consider, Warlocks are charisma, Paladins are charisma, Sorcerers are charisma, and then Druids and Clerics are wisdom, and there's just not a lot that uses intelligence. So it's probably going to be pretty effective against those kind of things. But it's really only good against casters, and it is single target, and it suffers from the same problem with, the legendary saves and whatnot, because anything that, by the time you're casting 8th level spells, anything that you're probably wanting to shut down with a Feeble Mind spell probably also has legendary resists. And maybe it doesn't. Maybe you're fighting some big boss guy and he's got, his like pet wizard dude there who's in his support, or cleric or warlock or whatever. And you're like, okay, well, my party's going to deal with the big guy. I'm going to shut down his support caster and I'm just going to feeble mind the guy. And in that case, it's pretty strong. But if you're targeting, things with legendary resists, it's not going to be a very good spell. So I have a hard time rating it. The effect it causes is amazing. The fact that it's good against almost every caster in the game except for wizards is actually pretty strong. But it's also worth remembering that even in general, like clerics and whatnot, they might have a great intelligence, but it might not suck either, So especially with monsters and NPCs and stuff and higher level stuff, where a lot of times they have multiple stats in the teens and 20s even. So, like I said, it's hard to rate. I guess I'll say it's a 3 out of 5 because it's decent, but it has a lot of limitations and weaknesses as well. Power word stun, it can be okay, but honestly, I'm not really a big fan of this spell, mostly because you don't really know how many hit points something has, and maybe your dungeon master kind of tells you, oh, it looks kind of wounded, it looks like it's half dead, it looks really wounded. Maybe they give you those kind of clues and you can kind of think, okay, I think it's probably in range for a power word stun. But it is a high level spell slot. It affects a decent number of hit points, which is okay. But at this level, your party is doing enough damage that, if something has like 150 hit points left, at least with my party, I know, between the Arcane Archer, the Barbarian, and the Paladin, they can easily dish out 150 damage in one round. More if they start dropping high-level spell slots on smites and using action surge and stuff like that. So if you're like, oh, well, I'm just going to stun it because now it's, below half, your party probably could just killed it and you could have saved an 8th level spell slot. Maybe you could have hit it with something else or whatever. It's not that it's a bad spell. It's just, I don't know. It's not necessarily the best choice out there either. And this 9th level spells, might as well start with power and kill, because a lot of what I just said with power and stun is going to apply to power and kill too. Except in this case, the threshold is even lower. Now, it is worth noting that there are some kind of weird combos you can pull with power and kill. Like you can polymorph something into like a snail or whatever, and then power and kill it, because it doesn't actually do damage. It just goes by how many hit points the creature has, and rules as written, and this was confirmed by like a sage advice that this does work. Now, personally, I don't know if that's how I treat it at my table. The situation hasn't come up yet, but I kind of think that those are like temporary hit points, and its real hit points are still there. It's just, it has these temporary hit points on top. I don't know. But either way, 80 hit points is not, or even 90 or 100, is not a lot of damage by the time you're 17th level and you're casting 9th level spells. So I think Power Word Kill is a great spell for NPCs to use on the party, especially because by now the party has access to Wish and Resurrection and True Resurrection. So having somebody die in combat isn't really as big a deal, as long as they don't wipe, right? As long as the party survives, if they lost somebody, they can probably get them back anyways. But using it on the monsters, I don't know. I find that usually the party can easily do the 80 or 90 or 100 points of damage that they need to do in order to finish something off. So, again, it's not a terrible choice. There are worse, like Imprison, that we'll talk about in a second. But it's not the greatest choice either. Imprison, and this used to be just an amazing spell back in 1st and 2nd edition. It was kind of hard to set up, but when it worked, it was basically just permanent banishment to this thing. And it is an awful spell now. I don't know. I'd have a hard time rationalizing anybody taking it over things like, True Polymorph, Shape Change, Wish. It's an awful spell for what it does. I do not like it. The only other, Wish is worth mentioning just because it's so versatile. If you need a Force Cage, you can just cast Wish. If you needed a Maze spell, you could just cast Wish. You can duplicate any 8th or lower level spell in the game with Wish, and the versatility of it alone makes it, the best control spell there is, because it can be any other control spell you want, except for, Imprisonment. Or Prismatic Wall. And Prismatic Wall is another excellent control spell. I didn't mention Prismatic Spray because you have a lot less control. And that's not to say Prismatic Spray can't be good. But Prismatic Spray, you're kind of like rolling the dice and hoping for the best. And maybe you just do a bit of damage, but maybe you inflict a ton of status effects on something, and that's great. But with Prismatic Wall, you actually know what's happening with the wall as they try to like break through layer by layer. And there's so many different effects. And some of them are just absolutely destructive, which in my opinion makes it an amazing spell. It's another one of these, 4 or 5 or maybe a 5 out of 5 even. It is a great spell. And because you can, choose like shape and whatnot, it has a lot of versatility to it. So I'm sure I missed a bunch, especially like non-wizard ones. I mostly just went with a few of the standouts like Whirlwind or Blade Barrier, which is worth mentioning as well for clerics. But in general, I wanted to mostly focus on wizards and the wizard spell list, and then where it overlaps with bards or sorcerers or whoever, because wizards really are just pretty much the premier battlefield controllers in this game. And like I said, it's not that warlocks and whatnot can't do the job as well, and can't do the job very well, because they can, but usually they're a lot more restricted on which spells they have access to or how many spells they even know. I mean, when you think about, like, by the time a sorcerer hits level 14, they have 14 known spells. So you're literally kind of having to budget yourself for 2 spells of every spell level, essentially. And that means that you can't just be like, well, I'm going to pick up a Hypnotic Pattern and Fear and Counterspell and Slow, like I said in the first video, all at once, because you can't afford to have 4 or 5 or 6 spells just at 3rd level when you only have 14 spells total. So it is definitely a limiting factor for them. Whereas the wizard can have a bunch of spells prepared, and maybe they don't need to use slow. Maybe they didn't need to use fly or haste or whatever. They don't really care. But they can have those spells prepared, and if they need them, they need them, and if they don't, they don't. Then they just cast Counterspell and Fireball, So in general, that's kind of basically everything I had to say, I think. So I'm just going to wrap this video up. As always, feel free to leave comments in the comment section. I promise to read every single comment, and since my channel is still very small, I can also promise that I will respond to all your comments as well. I might not be able to do that, if we ever get to like the point where we have 5 or 10 or 15,000 subs or whatever. But if it never gets there even, then that's fine. Then we can keep things more personal and intimate, and that's okay too. So feel free to like as well, and subscribe, and hit the bell, and everything else. And I will see you next time in the dungeon.